He was the man who defeated Napoleon, a strategist so brilliant that history remembers him as one of Britain's greatest military minds. But Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, was more than just a war hero. He was a leader shaped by relentless battles, political struggles, and a destiny that would change Europe forever. How did an ambitious young soldier rise to command the British Army? What strategies made him unstoppable on the battlefield? And what was the price he paid for victory? Stay with us as we uncover the incredible life of the Duke of Wellington, the man who shaped the fate of empires. The man known to history as Tsar for Wellesley was born in Dublin, Ireland, on the 1st of May 1769. His mother, and Hill Trevor, came from a wealthy and aristocratic banking family, and his father, Garrett Wellesley, 1st Earl of Mornington, was a local politician and composer, and was also professor of music at Trinity College in Dublin. The family were members of the Protestant Anglo-Irish ruling classes in Ireland, as the country was at this time still under English rule. The Protestant elite in Ireland, including the Wellesleys, lived separately from the Catholic majority on their estates, which did nothing but increase the already centuries-old resentment the Catholic Irish population had for their English overlords. The Wellesley family spent the majority of its time living between their two homes, one being in Dublin where Arthur was born and the other at the family estate at Dangon Castle, some 12 miles northwest of the Irish capital. Arthur was the third of 6 children and was generally considered by his family to be unintelligent. He soon became a gifted violin player, possibly due to his father's influence, and continued to enjoy playing music until early adulthood. Then, in 1791, when Arthur was 12, his father passed away aged only 45. This was disastrous for the family, as he had left them nothing but a mountain of debt, which now fell upon his eldest son, Richard Wellesley, the new Earl of Mornington, to deal with. This resulted in the family's assets, including Dangon Castle, having to be sold or rented out. This meant that the Wellesley family now had to earn their way in the world and may have ironically been a blessing in disguise, as it also meant the family had to work for their living, which could at least in part explain the level of success that Arthur and his brothers achieved during their lifetimes. Thankfully for Arthur, his brother Richard seems to have been shrewd in his judgment, as he then made the decision that the best way for the family to prosper going forward was by obtaining as good an education for his younger brothers as possible. This led to Arthur being sent to England's greatest public school, Eton, from 1781 to 1789. However, he failed to shine academically, resulting in his mother saying that she did not know what to do with him. He was then sent to France to a military academy in the hope that he would blossom. Indeed, he seems to have been a shy, lonely and idle young man, and perhaps lacked the confidence to fulfill his potential. But thankfully, he soon became an accomplished horseman, perhaps as a result of his close friendship with the governor's wife and military discipline. On his return from France, his mother was astonished by Arthur's transformation, commenting that he had become a very charming young man. Shortly afterwards, due to his brother's connections, he was bought a commission at the rank of ensign in the 73rd Regiment of Foot and was then made an aide-de-camp to the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland in Dublin. But Arthur soon started to fall back into his old habits of idleness, and he also started to gamble, and many debts soon racked up. Shortly after this, Arthur stood in the 1789 election to become a member of the Irish House of Commons, and after succeeding, served as a member of Parliament for the Rotten Borough of Trim, in which his family estate of Dangon Castle was situated, until 1791, when he was made a captain in the 58th Regiment of Foot and was then transferred to the more prestigious 18th Light Dragoons. Some months later, during this period, Arthur courted the Baron of Longford's daughter, Kitty Pakenham, whom he had known since childhood. The two were attracted to each other, Kitty later stating that she had loved him from the moment she had laid eyes on him. However, the Baron of Longford rejected Arthur's proposal of marriage, judging him to be too young and having little chance of a successful career. Wellesley was enraged by the rejection, even burning his beloved violin, and resolved after the events to concentrate his efforts on his career in order to prove himself worthy of Kitty's hand. This event, along with his father's early death, could be said to have been another of the turning points in Arthur's life, as he had until this time shown little sign of promise. But he was now more determined than ever to show both his family and his doubters what he was capable of. As it turned out, he did not have long to wait for such an opportunity. Since 1799, France had been in a state of economic crisis and revolution. This was caused in part by the ruling classes being unwilling to pay their fair share of taxes or give the middle classes or lower classes a say in the country's government, who were by this time impoverished and in a state of starvation. King Louis XVI was then forced to relinquish absolute power in favor of becoming a constitutional monarch, resulting in the nations of Europe, which still had monarchies or constitutional monarchies, being so alarmed by the rise of the lower classes in France that they formed the First Coalition and declared war on the newly created French Republic in 1792. Louis then attempted to flee France, as did large portions of the French nobility, but he was captured, tried for treason, and guillotined in January of 1793. This, in turn, led to a period of near chaos as various French governments rose and fell in counter-revolutions until the country was finally unified under Napoleon Bonaparte in the late 1790s. Britain was a member of the coalition against the French Republic, which resulted in the Duke of York being sent to Flanders to join the war in 1793, and Arthur, now a lieutenant colonel, was sent to the continent a year later from Ireland along with the 1st Regiment of Foot to reinforce the Duke of York's armies. But by the time of Arthur's arrival, the campaign had been largely decided and had resulted in the largest defeat the British Army had suffered since the American Revolutionary War. Wellesley was then involved in a number of defensive engagements against the advancing French forces, which ultimately led to the army's withdrawal from Europe back to England in 1795. The expedition's failure was in large part down to poor organization and logistics, as many men died in the freezing winter conditions, which taught Arthur the vital importance of supply in military campaigns, which he would become a master of later in his career. Indeed, Wellesley later wrote regarding his experiences during the campaign, "At least I learned what not to do, which is always a valuable lesson." The French Republic was still able, despite its domestic upheaval, to triumph in the War of the First Coalition, in large part due to the growing prowess of its military and the army's newly established meritocracy, which involved only the most able officers, including Napoleon, being promoted to command instead of the old system of the purchase of rank, which was prevalent under the monarchy. Wellesley, now a full colonel, was then sent in 1797 with his regiment to India, a voyage which would take nearly a year to complete. Indeed, his time in the subcontinent would prove to be the making of him, as he became one of the key figures in Britain's eventual subjugation of India. By the late 1700s, India was one of the key trading hubs in the Eastern world, which, along with its rich and fertile landscape, made it a prime target for the major Western powers who were now vying with one another for control of the flow of Indian goods. The British had by this time established a number of coastal territories in the subcontinent, such as Madras, Calcutta, and Bombay, but the French were also present in India, while the center of the country was still the domain of the various indigenous states, such as the Maratha Confederacy and the Kingdom of Mysore in the south. After his arrival, Arthur spent his first 12 months in India gaining knowledge of the country as well as its political situation and also training his troops so that they were as prepared as could be for any possible engagements, as well as the country's inhospitable climate. Then, in 1798, Wellesley received word that his eldest brother, Lord Mornington, had been made Governor-General of British territories in India, which proved to be crucial to his forthcoming rapid advancements over the coming years. It could be said that if it had not been for his brother's appointment, Arthur would have had little chance of advancement in India, which is almost certainly true. But it should also be remembered that his later success was still more than anything down to his own intelligence and ability, rather than just simple family connections. Indeed, Britain's increased activity in India was in part down to its wanting new territories after its loss in the American Revolutionary War, and it seems that Lord Mornington had been sent to India with a view to not only securing the British East India Company's monopoly on Indian trade but also making India a British territory. Another important factor was the French, whom the British could not allow to expand their own territories in the region, as it would risk Britain's trade networks and possibly tilt the balance of maritime power, which was at this time firmly in Britain's favor. In short, the British felt that the conquest of India was essential, as if they didn't control the subcontinent, another rival European power surely would. A common modern misconception of the age of European colonialism is that the Western powers purely conquered third world countries out of greed, but in reality, the land grab throughout the world was motivated by competition between the European nations, who were terrified that their rivals would gain more territory and wealth, which in turn could be used against them. Indeed, there is a certain body of opinion that the main reason for the European nations becoming dominant in the world was the intense and centuries-long rivalry and warfare between them, as they were in an almost continual arms race with one another, which inevitably meant that they were far more advanced technologically than other parts of the world. Lord Mornington then started preparations for the conquest of India, his first target being the rich southern kingdom of Mysore, which was under the rule of Tipu Sultan, the Tiger of Mysore, who was also allied with the French, who supplied him with arms and troops. Arthur was then placed in charge of the logistical preparations for the forthcoming war, drawing on his experiences in the failed British campaign in Flanders to plan the supply of the British forces to the best of his ability. The force which was then sent to take Mysore numbered in the region of 50,000 troops, a considerable number of which were native Indians. The British Army, under the overall command of General George Harris, then advanced towards Tipu Sultan's capital of Seringapatam, but were blocked some 20 miles short of their objective by a portion of the Sultan's army. On the 27th of March 1799, at Malavali, Arthur commanded the left flank of Harris's forces during the battle, which was itself attacked by a contingent of enemy infantry, prompting him to move his troops into line and give the orders to fire. He then commanded his men to fix bayonets and charge, which forced the enemy to retreat. The Battle of Malavali ended in a British victory, in which they forced the Sultan's forces to withdraw towards their capital, and the British then pursued them until Seringapatam itself was cut off and besieged. On the 5th of May 1799, after his arrival, Wellesley was ordered to conduct a night attack on enemy positions outside of Seringapatam, but he had no idea of the enemy's dispositions, and the attack ended with the British suffering nearly 24 casualties. After himself receiving a minor wound to his knee, the position was taken a day later, but Wellesley resolved after this never again to attack an enemy who was entrenched in a fixed position without having good reconnaissance. After a bombardment of the fortress which lasted for some weeks, a breach was made in its walls, which allowed the British to invest Tipu's stronghold, and after heavy fighting, Seringapatam fell, and the Sultan himself was killed. Southern India was now firmly under British control. Arthur had gained valuable experience in the art of warfare. Also, as a reward for his efforts, he was, a day after the Battle of Seringapatam, given the governorship of Mysore. There had been widespread pillaging and raping by British troops in the battle's aftermath, and Arthur restored order by having the ringleaders amongst the British troops hanged. Indeed, Wellesley soon gained a reputation as a strict disciplinarian during his 3 years governing Mysore, in which he clamped down on British corruption and lawlessness. Indeed, Wellesley once wrote, "If we lose our character for truth and good faith, we have but little to stand upon in this country." These words would prove to be accurate, as over the next 150 years of British rule in India, the population was steadily treated more and more harshly, eventually resulting in the move to its independence. After the fall of Mysore, Wellesley also had to put down a large-scale insurrection by Tipu Sultan's followers. He then later combined East India Company and British Army forces numbering around 8,000 troops to put down the uprising, which ended in the Battle of Konagal on the 10th of September 1800. Lord Mornington was impressed by his providence and then sought to further Arthur's as well as his own reputation, along with increasing British power, by then launching an attack on the greatest power in India, the Maratha Confederacy. The Marathas were a powerful coalition of smaller kingdoms which had during the 17th century replaced the Mughal Empire as the dominant power in the subcontinent and were by this time, like the kingdom of Mysore before them, allied with the French. Wellesley, who had now been promoted to the rank of general, was in charge of the British forces and took it upon himself to see that the army's training and supplies were as well prepared as possible. He did this by ensuring the constant supply of food and materials by the use of boats and local wagons, which carried the troops and the massive quantities of food on which his 25,000-strong force would depend. He then, in 1803, launched an attack on a Maratha fort, which was quickly taken after his artillery breached its walls. He then sought to locate the main Maratha army by splitting his forces into two. The British then advanced deeper into hostile enemy territory until Wellesley received intelligence of the location of the Maratha army and planned to trap it in a pincer movement between his two separate forces. But his finger down his own force was in very close proximity to the enemy, and having surveyed their position, he chose to attack despite being outnumbered by as many as 4-1 and the enemy possessing as many as 100 cannon. Wellesley would later describe the following Battle of Assaye as one of the hardest of his career. Indeed, it was definitely one of the most important, as failure would have meant possible disaster for his own reputation and the fortunes of the British in the war itself. The Marathas, however, were in a strong position across the river Kanhir, which lay in the path of the British advance. But Wellesley was able to cross the river downstream and attack the enemy on their left flank. The British then formed line with their cavalry close behind and engaged the enemy, whilst Wellesley rode up and down the British line ensuring that each regiment knew what was expected of it. Eventually, after a series of hard-fought engagements and near retreats, the British managed to force the Marathas to flee but were unable to pursue them, as many of their men could hardly stand, let alone walk or run due to exhaustion. Wellesley had gambled everything on attacking the Marathas, and due to the experience he had gained during his previous years in India, along with his logistical mastery and the training of his men, he had been able to claim victory despite losing nearly a quarter of his army. Arthur then left his wounded behind in a nearby town and advanced further north until he inflicted another defeat on the Marathas near Aligarh, in which they lost any 5,000 casualties, while the British lost only 500. They then moved on to besiege, assault, and capture the Maratha fort of Aligarh on the 15th of December 1803. His victories, along with another British campaign further north, effectively ended the Marathas' hopes of maintaining their independence, and they were then forced to accept British rule. Wellesley was then made a Knight of the Order of the Bath and set sail along with his brother for home in 1805, proclaiming that he had served more time in India than any man should. After returning to London, Wellesley was sitting in a waiting room at the Secretary of War's offices when he came face to face with Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson, who was by this time already a legend after his victories over Napoleon's navy at the Battle of the Nile. At first, Wellesley thought Nelson to be arrogant, as the admiral clearly didn't know who Wellesley was. But after Nelson had seen the Secretary of War, he took the time to speak to Arthur once again, in which the two discussed the state of the colonies and the war situation against the French. Afterwards, Wellesley later stated that it was one of the most interesting conversations of his life, but the two were never to meet again, as Nelson was killed under 2 months later during his great victory in the Battle of Trafalgar. Despite Arthur not seeing his childhood sweetheart Kitty Pakenham for almost a decade, he had promised to marry her after his return, which Kitty's family had accepted due to his growing reputation and success. She advised him to meet her before the ceremony, which he declined. But when they did finally meet before the wedding, Arthur complained to his brother that she had grown ugly, but the marriage went ahead regardless in April of 1806, perhaps out of a sense of mutual duty and honor rather than love, as Kitty had not married in Arthur's decade-long absence, and he had, after all, promised to prove himself to her family in order to win her hand. The two were no longer the match they had been in their youth, as Kitty had had a sheltered upbringing, whilst Arthur had been on campaign and had returned to England a completely different man. But they still remained together for over 25 years and parented 2 sons named Arthur and Charles. But after Wellesley's first and greatest passion in life would always be his career and the army, and soon after his marriage, despite venturing once again into politics, he sought to gain another command. He then got his chance in 1808 when he was appointed to command a 9,000-strong force, which was to travel to South America tasked with attacking Spain's colonies. But both Wellesley and his army were then diverted to Britain's ally Portugal, who had been attacked itself by the combined forces of France and Spain. Wellesley was at last to get the opportunity he had been waiting for to lead a British campaign on mainland Europe, but Napoleon's armies in Spain were formidable to say the least, as the emperor was by this time in control of the majority of mainland Europe. Once again, Arthur Wellesley was outnumbered, outgunned, and leading his troops in a foreign land. Failure would mean the ruination of his name and would further strengthen Napoleon's grip over the continent. Preventing the fall of Portugal alone would require an empirical effort to accomplish, but Wellesley, as usual, was unfazed by the momentous task which lay before him, and in the summer of 1808, he set sail from Ireland at the head of his army for Portugal, where failure or fortune awaited him. From the battlefields of India to the decisive victory at Waterloo, Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, proved himself as one of history's greatest military commanders. His sharp mind and unshakable determination not only defeated Napoleon but also shaped the future of Europe. Yet, beyond the battlefield, he faced political challenges, personal struggles, and the burden of greatness. His legacy lives on, not just in history books, but in the very foundations of modern warfare and leadership. The Iron Duke was more than just a soldier. He was a symbol of resilience, strategy, and the power of unwavering determination. His story is one that will never be forgotten.